Since the West imposed its unprecedented sanctions on Russia last year, two schools of thought have quickly emerged. The first, which is pushed by Putin and the Kremlin, claims that the West's sanctions have been wholly ineffective, as evidenced by the strength of the ruble and Russia's smaller than expected economic contraction. Now, this has been one of Putin's favourite talking points, and he's even previously dismissed the West's sanctions as nonsense aimed at people who can't read or write. The second school of thought, though, which is predominantly pushed by certain hawkish American commentators and occasionally certain Western governments, is that Russia is just lying about its economic data, and that sanctions are in fact crippling the Russian economy, as evidenced by the Russian central bank's decision to stop publishing most of its data at the beginning of the war, and the fact that certain industries, which we've got good data on, like the Russian car industry, have apparently been crippled by sanctions. Unsurprisingly, it looks like the truth is somewhere between these two. According to a recent retrospective analysis by the Russia Group, a network of Russia experts, including former top figures from Russia's finance ministry and central bank, sanctions have actually had an enormous effect on what we might call Russia's real economy, but that this effect was disguised and offset by Russia's higher-than-average hydrocarbon revenues, which the Kremlin used to plug the gaps in Russia's economy. So in this video, we're going to take a look at this report, why Western sanctions have failed to stem Russia's oil revenues, and what this tells us about how the West can defeat Putin in the future. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's get straight into the report. According to its lead author, a Russian political scientist, although Russia's hydrocarbon industry does seem to have done well, parts of Russia's economy that are not directly or indirectly supported by its hydrocarbon industry have been seriously affected by sanctions. The West's unprecedented sanctions triggered capital outflows worth 12% of GDP, which means roughly $200 billion worth of assets flooded out of Russia into the rest of the world last year. Now, usually this would precipitate an economic disaster, but the Russian economy was able to weather the storm thanks to its enormous oil revenues. According to a report by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, a research organization based out of Helsinki, Russia sold about 93 billion euros worth of energy exports in the first 100 days of the invasion, an all-time record, and 20% more than they did during the same period in the previous year. Now, this translates to about 930 million euros a day, nearly 100 million euros more than the estimated 840 million that Russia was spending per day on the invasion. And that's because while exports have decreased in terms of volume, largely due to the fact that the EU reduced its imports by 23%, volume has only actually fallen quite slightly, largely because China and India have made up for the shortfall. And these higher-than-average hydrocarbon revenues helped Russia to beat the most pessimistic forecasts for last year, with the Russian economy only shrinking by 2% in 2022. Now, a couple of caveats are in order here. Firstly, these numbers should be taken with a pinch of salt. The Russian Statistical Authority was suspiciously slow to release these figures, and a non-trivial amount of Russia's GDP will be taken up by military manufacturing, a significant fraction of which will end up being destroyed on the battlefield in the near future. And this also doesn't mean that the West's energy sanctions have been completely ineffective. After all, it's worth saying that Russian oil is currently selling for about 20% less than the international benchmark, thanks to the fact that Russia can't sell to most of the Western world, and the G7 oil price cap has made exporting to other countries more expensive. Nonetheless, the fact that Russian oil was selling for more than $60 at the start of April, i.e. above the price cap, suggests that the whole system isn't working quite as well as the West hoped. And it's at least possible that the disruption to supply chains caused by sanctions has materially increased oil prices to Russia's benefit. Anyway, you get the idea. Even though sanctions did damage Russia's real economy, they didn't really affect hydrocarbon revenues, which bailed the Kremlin out. And in some sense, this should be unsurprising. This is how the Russian and Soviet economies have always worked. When oil prices are high, things are good, and when they're low, well, they're bad. High oil prices preceded the Soviet Union's ambitious intervention into Afghanistan in 1979. Low oil prices preceded the collapse of the Soviet Union, and high oil prices again made Putin popular in the early years of his premiership and encouraged him to invade in both 2014 and 2022. And that's maybe why John McCain once described Russia as a gas station masquerading as a country. This all raises the question then, why didn't the West's energy sanctions work? Well, it's in part because, as we mentioned earlier, the disruption caused by energy sanctions pushed up prices around the globe. For example, when the West stopped buying natural gas from Russia, they instead started buying up liquefied natural gas, or LNG, on international markets. This then pushed up the price of LNG, allowing Russian energy companies to sell their LNG for more, which meant that, at least in some cases, Russian energy companies actually profited from the sanctions. More generally though, energy sanctions just didn't really work because, well, people just really want oil and gas badly. Hydrocarbons, and especially oil, are the material basis of the modern economy, which is why, even if you sanction them, importers will usually find a way around the sanctions. Unfortunately for the West then, this means that the only real way to hurt the Russian economy and Putin's war effort is to somehow bring down the cost of oil prices. So, how can they do this? Well, in the past, the West has been able to influence international oil prices via the US-Saudi relationship. As the world's largest oil producer, the leader of OPEC, and the only so-called swing producer, i.e. the only country able to increase and decrease production quickly, Saudi Arabia has had an enormous influence over oil prices. And historically, as Saudi Arabia's main security partner in a region beset by geopolitical insecurity, the US could usually convince the Saudis to increase or decrease production as they wanted. Unfortunately for the West though, US-Saudi relations have deteriorated sharply under Biden, who has attacked the Saudis for their questionable human rights record and threatened to make them a, quote, pariah state during the campaign. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, since Biden came into office, the Saudis have repeatedly cut production to push up prices and buddied up ever closer with Putin. So this leaves the West, and especially the Biden regime, with an uncomfortable dilemma. Do they drop their human rights concerns and risk diplomatic embarrassment to try and restore the US-Saudi relationship, or do they continue being critical of the Saudis, even if that helps Putin in Ukraine? Ultimately, this could be a crucial decision in the war, a decision made miles from the battlefield, but ultimately dictating if Putin's economy is able to survive. So, if you want to be updated as this story plays out, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and check out more content across the entire TLDR network. You might not already know, but we actually have 5 different TLDR channels explaining the news from the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world, breaking down the latest developments in the business world, and running you through the day's most important news that you might otherwise have missed. And TLDR has been doing this for about 6 years now. So to celebrate our anniversary, we'd love it if you subscribed. Not only to this channel, but also any of the others that interest you too. They're all linked in the description. Anyway, our whole purpose is to make the world around you more understandable, to unpack the confusing parts of the news in a way that's interesting, factual, and entirely non-partisan. So if that's something that you're into, then you have 5 channels to enjoy. And regardless, thank you so much for your support over the last 6 years. It really means a lot.